The CEO's assistant looked down her nose at me, deliberately, before she tipped a scalding cup of coffee straight onto my 80-page data report. "You cannot sit with us," she sneered, loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. "This area is for executives, not for some 33-year-old nobody analyst." I just smiled and calmly wiped down my cheap blazer. Little did she know that the 5-carat diamond ring tucked inside my purse cost more than her entire annual salary, and that I was only working there undercover, quietly evaluating the staff before my billionaire husband finalized his acquisition of the company. My name is Gemma. I'm 33 years old, and this is the story of how I let arrogant people dig their own graves, one shovelful of pride at a time. Before I go on, let me know in the comments below where you're watching from. And if you've ever dealt with toxic coworkers who badly underestimated who you really were, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. It was a Tuesday morning at Carmichael Tech, a mid-sized software company in downtown Chicago that worked very hard to project an image of extreme wealth and cutting-edge innovation. The corporate cafeteria was a perfect symbol of their misplaced priorities. A sprawling room with floor-to-ceiling glass windows, brushed steel tables, and an absurdly overpriced espresso bar that served artisanal lattes to people who couldn't keep the company's product roadmap on schedule. I was sitting at a corner booth near the so-called executive section, quietly reviewing the massive user data and risk assessment report I'd spent the last 3 weeks compiling. My eyes were locked on the printed spreadsheets in front of me. I was so deep in tracing a series of alarming financial discrepancies buried inside the user acquisition metrics that I never noticed the shadow falling over my table until it was already too late. A heavy ceramic mug slammed down on the edge of my desk. Before I could even glance up, a wave of scalding caramel macchiato washed across my paperwork. The dark liquid soaked straight through the printed pages, ruining 3 weeks of meticulously organized data in seconds, and splashed onto my lap, soaking into the fabric of my plain black blazer. The heat bit into my skin instantly. I gasped and shoved my chair back, the metal legs screeching against the polished concrete floor. The sound cut through the cafeteria like a gunshot, and dozens of conversations died at once. Every employee in the room turned to look at me. I looked up and found myself face to face with Sloan. She was 29, held the title of executive assistant to the CEO, and walked through the building like she personally owned every square foot of it. She wore a tight red designer dress and a pair of heels that clicked like a metronome of arrogance whenever she marched down the hallway to boss someone around. Now she stood over my ruined table with a satisfied, malicious little smirk, not even bothering to pretend the spill had been an accident. "You're in the wrong section," Sloan said. Her voice was artificially sweet but pitched loud enough to make sure the entire cafeteria caught every word. "I told you last week this seating is reserved strictly for the board and executive staff. You don't have clearance to sit here. Grab your little lunchbox and your ruined papers and go sit by the trash cans where you belong. You're just a 33-year-old data analyst. Nobody in this building cares about your spreadsheets. You're a nobody, and it's time you learned your place." The cafeteria stayed dead silent. People watched, wide-eyed, clearly expecting me to burst into tears or flee the room in shame. It was humiliating, no question. The coffee was sticky and uncomfortable against my skin, and the public spectacle had been designed precisely to break me. But I didn't cry, and I didn't yell. I simply stood, pulled a napkin from the dispenser, and calmly dabbed at the stains on my blazer, my expression giving away absolutely nothing. If Sloan had any idea of the truth, she would have been the one fleeing the room in tears. Inside my plain, unbranded leather tote, resting on the chair beside me, sat a small velvet box. Inside that box was a flawless, custom-designed 5-carat diamond engagement ring, the one I took off every single morning before walking through the doors of Carmichael Tech. I swapped my designer wardrobe for off-the-rack basics. I traded my Maybach for a sensible sedan. I did all of it to blend in, to stay completely under the radar, because I wasn't just a struggling senior data analyst trying to make rent in Chicago. I was secretly married to Liam Kensington, the 36-year-old self-made billionaire and founder of Kensington Holdings, one of the most ruthless and powerful private equity firms in the country. Right at that exact moment, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I didn't even need to check it to know who it was. Liam texted me every morning, right on schedule, like clockwork. The message read, "Wife, how's the garbage company doing today? Found what you're looking for, or should I just go ahead and buy them out and gut the place?" I smiled to myself. 2 years earlier, I had applied for this job entirely on my own merit. I wanted to build my own artificial intelligence project from the ground up, relying on nothing but my own brain and my own work ethic. Liam had practically begged me to come run a division at his firm instead, but I valued my independence too much to take the easy road. And now the joke was very much on Carmichael Tech. The company was drowning in debt, and its only realistic hope of survival was a desperately needed buyout from my husband's fund. I was, quite literally, the undercover auditor who held their entire future in my coffee-stained hands. I had already shared my suspicions with my 38-year-old brother-in-law, Trey, an African-American corporate lawyer famous across Chicago for taking fraudulent companies apart piece by piece. Trey had told me to be patient, to gather hard evidence, and to wait for these people to expose their own corruption. I dropped the damp napkin onto the ruined pile of papers and looked Sloan dead in the eye. Her smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, the moment she realized her schoolyard bullying wasn't landing the way she expected. I opened my mouth, ready to tell her exactly who would end up cleaning up this mess, but a murmur rippled through the watching crowd before I could get the words out. The heavy glass doors of the cafeteria swung open, and Bradley Carmichael, the 45-year-old chief executive officer, strode into the room wearing an expensive gray suit and an air of total self-importance. Employees parted in front of him like he was royalty. Bradley took in the scene at a glance. Sloan standing there with the empty mug, me dripping in coffee, the destroyed report scattered across the table. Any decent leader would have immediately reprimanded his assistant for behaving so unprofessionally. Bradley didn't even glance in Sloan's direction. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked onto me, and he marched straight toward my table wearing a dark, threatening expression. He offered no apology. He said nothing about his assistant destroying company property or harassing a member of staff. Instead, he reached right past my shoulder and snatched the dripping stack of papers off the table. Hot coffee splattered onto his polished Italian leather shoes, and he didn't even flinch. His eyes scanned greedily across the top page. The artificial intelligence user acquisition model I'd spent 3 exhausting weeks building, the product of countless late nights staring at a glowing screen until my eyes burned, writing the code that mapped out future consumer behavior with uncanny precision. Bradley flipped through the damp, coffee-stained pages, and a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. He tapped the paper with his index finger, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. "Excellent work on the data processing," he said smoothly, completely indifferent to the fact that I was soaked through. "I'll be taking this for the investor pitch this afternoon. This is exactly the leverage we need to close the deal." I held my ground, keeping my voice level and professional despite the sticky liquid clinging to my clothes. "That's my proprietary algorithm, Mr. Carmichael," I said. "The predictive models are highly complex. I need to be in that meeting to present the data correctly, or the investors might misread the projected churn rates and flag the valuation as a risk." Bradley let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed through the silent cafeteria. Sloan giggled right on cue, stepping closer to her boss and folding her arms across her chest. Bradley looked me up and down with open disgust, taking in my coffee-stained lapels, my unbranded skirt, my sensible flats. "You want to present to Kensington Holdings?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "Don't make me laugh. You look like a discount store clerk. We're meeting with serious money today, not entry-level coders. I need polished executives in that boardroom to project stability and wealth. You'd embarrass this entire firm. Sloan will accompany me instead. She actually knows how to represent corporate luxury." Sloan practically glowed with pride, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder and shooting me a look of pure, venomous triumph. "Don't worry about a thing, Gemma," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I'll make sure to explain your little charts nice and clearly for the rich men. You just focus on cleaning up your mess before HR writes you up for being a distraction." Bradley didn't bother looking at me again. He spun on his heel and marched out of the cafeteria, clutching my work tightly to his chest, Sloane's heels clicking an arrogant, victorious rhythm behind him. I watched them go, and it took every ounce of self-control I had not to burst out laughing right there on the spot. They genuinely believed they'd just put me in my place. They thought they'd just secured the win of their careers. I walked back to my desk in the analytics department, ignoring the pitying glances of my coworkers along the way. 2 years earlier, Liam had offered me a custom corner office at his private equity firm, complete with a 6-figure salary and a dedicated analyst team at my disposal. I had turned him down flat. I wanted to build this artificial intelligence project on my own, to prove that my brain, not my marriage certificate, was my greatest asset. Carmichael Tech had seemed like the perfect sandbox, a struggling mid-tier software company where I could quietly refine my algorithms without anyone scrutinizing me too closely. Now the irony of the whole situation was almost too rich to handle. I knew exactly how bad things really were behind those sleek glass doors. Carmichael Tech was drowning in toxic debt. Their cash burn rate was astronomical, and core product development had stalled out months ago. Their only lifeline, their one desperate shot at avoiding total collapse, was a buyout from Kensington Holdings, and Bradley was about to steal my work and sell it directly to my own husband, standing in a luxury boardroom in his expensive suit, trying to convince Liam Kensington to buy an algorithm his own wife had written from their living room couch. It was the kind of poetic justice money simply cannot purchase. I reached my small cubicle and dropped into my cheap ergonomic chair. My blazer was ruined, but I ignored the discomfort entirely, opened my laptop, and cracked my knuckles. If Bradley wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate espionage and intellectual theft, I was more than happy to deal the next hand. Because of my senior clearance in the analytics department, I had backdoor access to the raw server databases, not the polished numbers the executive team showed to the public, but the actual source code, the real financial transactions, the user retention logs, and the hidden server maintenance costs. I ran a deep diagnostic sweep on the revenue projections Bradley had just stolen from me, wanting to know exactly how he planned to fold my AI model into the company's inflated valuation pitch. My fingers moved fast across the keyboard, slipping past the standard security firewalls with a handful of custom scripts I'd written myself. I pulled up the master financial ledger and cross-referenced it against the user acquisition data I'd compiled the night before. The progress bar blinked steadily as the system chewed through millions of internal data points. Then the results populated on my screen, and I leaned in, narrowing my eyes at the glowing red text. The numbers were completely wrong. They didn't match the organic growth charts at all. I ran the diagnostic a second time, carefully tracing the source of the massive discrepancy, and my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a simple accounting error or a sloppy projection. It was a deliberate, engineered financial loophole. Millions of dollars in reported revenue were entirely fabricated, propped up by ghost accounts and phantom user data. The company wasn't just failing organically. Someone at the very top of the executive chain was actively embezzling funds, routing company money into untraceable offshore accounts, while pumping up the official valuation with numbers that simply didn't exist. And they intended to use my own flawless algorithm to disguise the theft right in front of the Kensington Holdings investment team. I stared at the glowing red figures on my monitor, genuinely stunned by the sheer scale of the deception unfolding in front of me. Bradley Carmichael wasn't just an arrogant executive with a superiority complex. He was orchestrating a massive financial illusion, fully intending to use my proprietary models to artificially inflate user engagement numbers and blind any standard due diligence team. And he wasn't presenting this fabrication to just any investors. He was about to walk into a luxury boardroom and feed this fraudulent data directly to Kensington Holdings. He was about to try to defraud my own husband. I reached into my unbranded tote and pulled out my encrypted personal phone, bypassing my standard contacts to open a secure communication app, and called Trey. Trey, 38 years old and happily married to my older sister, had built a fearsome, near-legendary reputation across Chicago's legal district. As a senior partner specializing in aggressive mergers, hostile takeovers, and white-collar prosecution, he was known throughout the financial sector simply as the executioner. Whenever a fraudulent company needed to be carefully dismantled and liquidated, Trey was the man holding the axe. Our relationship was built on a shared respect for hard facts and ruthless professional efficiency. The encrypted line connected on the second ring. "Gemma," Trey said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded authority in any room. "It's a Tuesday morning. You don't usually call the encrypted line unless somebody's about to face a federal indictment. What exactly do we have?" I kept my voice low, careful not to let it carry over the steady hum of the analytics floor. "We have a massive toxic liability masquerading as a profitable tech acquisition, Trey. I just ran a deep sweep on the raw server data at Carmichael Tech. Bradley is pitching to Liam and the Kensington Holdings Investment Board this afternoon. I'm looking at their preliminary term sheets right now," Trey replied calmly, the sharp rhythmic click of his keyboard audible over the line. "Carmichael Tech is officially asking for a $50 million buyout. Their summary claims 40% revenue growth across the last 2 fiscal quarters." "It's completely fabricated," I said flatly, scanning the hidden ledgers in front of me. "I'm looking directly at the back-end transaction logs right now. The organic growth charts don't match the real user data at all. Bradley's artificially inflating EBITDA using a network of ghost accounts to simulate user acquisition and daily engagement that simply doesn't exist." Trey stopped typing. The silence on the line was thick with realization. "Ghost accounts? Are you telling me their core product revenue is essentially fictional?" "Not entirely fictional, heavily inflated to mask a catastrophic burn rate," I explained, pulling up another hidden spreadsheet. "He's torching venture capital at an absurd pace, but the official balance sheets look spotless because he's hiding the operational losses in off-balance sheet entities. And that's not even the worst part. Bradley just stole my proprietary AI predictive models. He physically tore the printed report out of my hands in the cafeteria. He's going to present my algorithm to Liam as if it belongs to his own team." Trey let out a short, sharp breath, immediately grasping the implications. "He's going to use your own neural network projections to validate his fake user data, right in front of your husband. That's bold, and it's monumentally stupid." "Exactly," I said, my fingers already flying across the keyboard to compile evidence. "My algorithm is built to predict long-term consumer behavior based on genuine engagement data. If Bradley feeds his fabricated ghost accounts into my model, it'll spit out a flawless, highly profitable 5-year projection. It will completely blind Kensington's standard due diligence process. Their analysts will check the math, see that it works, and authorize the $50 million deal without ever realizing the underlying data is rotten to the core. He's masking a sinking ship with your gold-plated mathematics, Trey said, his tone going cold and dangerous. This isn't gross mismanagement anymore. This is federal wire fraud, and it's a serious violation of SEC regulations. If Liam signs that term sheet, Kensington Holdings absorbs millions in toxic debt and potentially faces shareholder lawsuits for failing to catch the fraud. We can't let him sign today, I said urgently. But if I call Liam right now and warn him, Bradley will figure out who I really am almost instantly, and the whole operation collapses before I can trace where the missing money is actually going. I'm seeing routing patterns that look like shell companies based in the Cayman Islands. I heard Trey shift in his heavy office chair, his sharp legal mind already working the problem over. You need to hold your cover, Gemma. The moment Bradley realizes he's been harboring the wife of the billionaire he's trying to defraud, he'll panic. He'll start shredding hard drives, wiping servers, burning the entire paper trail before we can secure a federal warrant. I've already compiled an encrypted packet, raw server logs, the real financial ledgers, and exact timestamps showing precisely when Bradley accessed and downloaded my report, I told him. Routing it to your secure server now. A soft digital chime confirmed the transfer had gone through. Got it, Trey said, his tone shifting into the cold, calculated register he reserved for taking apart hostile corporate entities. I'll review the ledgers personally. We're going to build an airtight case Bradley can't possibly wriggle out of. We need irrefutable proof of the offshore embezzlement to trigger federal intervention. What do you want me to do about the presentation this afternoon? I asked, watching the clock on my monitor tick closer to the meeting. Sloan and Bradley are about to walk into that boardroom thinking they've already won the lottery. They think I'm just a helpless data analyst who can't fight back. Let them keep believing it, Trey said smoothly. Pride is always the easiest weakness to exploit in a criminal. We're going to let Bradley walk in there and present his fraudulent data with total confidence directly to Kensington Holdings. We're going to let him happily bury himself on the official record, in his own words. And when the timing's perfect, we drop the legal guillotine. And my position here at the company? I asked, locking my screen. Hold it, Trey answered with absolute certainty. I'll start a stealth audit of his cash flow tonight. The following afternoon, the mood inside Carmichael Tech shifted from tense quiet to obnoxious celebration. The glass doors swung open, and Bradley marched onto the analytics floor like a conquering emperor, dressed in a custom navy suit, flushed with the thrill of a deception he believed had gone off without a hitch. The pitch to Kensington Holdings had wrapped an hour earlier, and according to the story he was loudly telling anyone within earshot, the investment board had been completely captivated by the predictive models I'd spent weeks coding. He paraded through the cubicles soaking up congratulations from sycophantic managers, having simply memorized my executive summary, slapped his own name across the title page, and sold my work straight to my own husband. His fraudulent pitch had landed perfectly. The bait had been swallowed whole. Within 20 minutes, Sloan had taken over the floor to organize a lavish celebration, ordering catered sushi, artisanal pastries, and overpriced champagne, all charged directly to a company expense account that was already hemorrhaging cash. Corks popped, music blared from a speaker, and the entire workflow ground to a halt. Sloan stationed herself right beside Bradley, laughing loudly at his jokes and pouring drinks, beaming as though she'd personally closed the $50 million deal herself. I stayed at my desk, sipping water from a paper cup, watching the hypocrisy unfold with cold detachment. They were popping champagne on the deck of a ship that was already taking on water. I kept my eyes on my monitor, finishing a secondary data packet for Trey, when I caught a flash of red fabric moving toward my cubicle out of the corner of my eye. Sloan stepped into my workspace, the cloying scent of her perfume rolling off her like a toxic cloud, holding a long handwritten list of complicated coffee orders and shaking it to get my attention. Her eyes gleamed with the kind of predatory delight she reserved for women she considered beneath her and in her shallow worldview, a 33-year-old analyst in a sensible sweater made the perfect target. "Gemma, stop pretending to look busy," she said, raising her voice just enough to make sure the nearby analysts could hear her contempt. "The executive team is exhausted from closing the biggest deal in this company's history. Run down to the cafe on the ground floor and grab these 20 coffee orders. Get the oat milk ratios right this time. You botched my latte last week, and I'm not putting up with incompetence today." I slowly took my hands off the keyboard and looked up at her. "I'm a senior data analyst," I said evenly. "Running errands for the executive team isn't in my job description. You're the executive assistant. Fetching coffee is literally your function." Sloan let out a sharp, mocking laugh and leaned over my desk, palms flat on the surface, trying to crowd me. "You should be down on your knees thanking me for even giving you a task, Gemma. You should be grateful Bradley took pity on your pathetic little spreadsheet and used it in his pitch today. That report is the only reason you're still sitting in that cheap chair. If he hadn't made your boring numbers look impressive, you'd have been cut in last month's layoffs. You're completely replaceable. Now take the list, go get the coffee, and play the good little assistant before I have HR walk you out." I didn't blink. I didn't show a flicker of fear. Instead, I calmly opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick document bound in a bright yellow folder, the official corporate compliance and tax liability report Sloan had been assigned to complete 3 days earlier. With my elevated clearance, I'd reviewed her submission the day before, and it was a catastrophic failure of basic administrative competence. She'd botched the state tax codes, misclassified independent contractors, and failed to secure the necessary vendor liability signatures. Her carelessness had exposed the company to hundreds of thousands of dollars in immediate regulatory fines. I stood up, walked straight past her without a word, and crossed the office with slow, deliberate steps toward the heart of the celebration. The chatter died down as people noticed me approaching. Bradley stopped mid-sentence, frowning as I interrupted his moment of glory. I reached the main table, pushed aside an untouched tray of sushi, and set the bright yellow folder down on the glass surface with a crack, loud enough to silence the room. "I won't be fetching your coffee, Sloan," I said, my voice ringing out clear across the now silent floor. "But since you're so deeply concerned with corporate competence today, maybe you'd like to explain this to the executive team. This is the tax compliance report you submitted to the State Regulatory Board on Tuesday. You miscalculated the payroll tax brackets, failed to file the vendor disclosures, and legally exposed this firm to a massive financial penalty." The color drained from Sloane's face. Her smirk vanished, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. She stumbled forward, her heels slipping slightly on the polished floor. "That's a complete lie," she stammered, her voice climbing as the entire room stared. "You're making that up to deflect from your own insubordination." I tapped the yellow folder twice with my finger, ignoring her completely, and let my eyes settle on Bradley, whose expression had curdled into fury, perfectly setting the stage for what came next. The silence was absolute. Bradley stared at the folder like it might detonate. The forced laughter from the junior managers died instantly. Sloan stood frozen, her face flushing a deep red that clashed badly with her expensive dress. She opened her mouth to defend herself, and nothing came out. The evidence of her incompetence sat right there in front of the entire executive staff, exposing the company to serious regulatory risk. I didn't wait for Bradley to demand an explanation. I'd already made my point with total clarity. I turned my back on their lavish buffet and walked calmly to my cubicle. A few junior analysts exchanged wide-eyed, terrified glances. I sat down, resumed typing, and let the toxic energy radiating from the center of the room wash right past me. The party dissolved within minutes. Bradley snatched the folder and stormed toward the executive suites, his expression like a thundercloud, while Sloan stood alone amid the melting ice sculptures, trembling with a rage so sharp it seemed to vibrate the air around her, her glare promising retribution. People like Sloan never accepted defeat gracefully. They survived on petty vengeance. I just had to wait for her next fatal mistake. The office slowly settled back into its usual rhythm, though the tension underneath stayed thick. An hour passed quietly while I kept my dual monitors busy with data queries, finishing the encrypted evidence packets for Trey. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Sloan pacing near the break room, agitated, furiously texting on her phone, moving back and forth like a caged animal. Then her attention shifted toward the intern workstations. The interns had all been dismissed early, leaving their computers unattended in sleep mode. Sloan glanced around to confirm the senior managers were locked away in their offices, not realizing my desk gave me a perfect reflection of that row through the conference room's glass partition. I watched her slip into a young data entry clerk's empty workstation, lean over the keyboard, and start typing rapidly, scanning the shared network drive for something specific. She clicked a few times, executed a deletion, and stepped back fast, smoothing her dress and composing her face into a mask of innocence before walking away as though nothing had happened. I immediately pulled up the internal network access logs on my second screen. A small but crucial client retention database had just been permanently wiped, sensitive demographic data belonging to one of the few legitimate retail clients Carmichael Tech still had left. 10 minutes later, a piercing theatrical shriek cut across the analytics floor. Sloan came rushing out of the junior analyst section, clutching her company tablet to her chest, her face contorted into a mask of manufactured panic. She sprinted toward the executive corridor, causing maximum disruption along the way. "The server's compromised!" she screamed. "The retail client database has been wiped clean. Someone deliberately deleted the core retention files." Analysts popped their heads up over their cubicles in alarm. Managers stepped out of their offices. Bradley emerged from his corner suite, his face dark with irritation at the sudden chaos, and marched onto the floor demanding an immediate explanation. Sloan practically hurled herself at him, performing distress with theatrical precision. Then she jabbed a trembling finger straight at my desk, her whole arm shaking for effect. "It was her," Sloan accused loudly, making absolutely certain every single employee on the floor heard her venomous, carefully chosen words. "Gemma did it. I just saw her walking away from the intern sector 2 minutes ago. She logged into the junior terminals to wipe the client data clean. She is trying to sabotage the firm from the inside. She is trying to ruin the Kensington Holdings acquisition because she is insanely, pathetically jealous that you took her report and secured the deal without her." A collective gasp rippled through the junior staff, spreading from desk to desk like wildfire. It was an incredibly reckless lie, a vile frame-up executed with all the subtlety and grace of a high school drama queen mid-meltdown. Sloan was projecting her own deep-seated insecurities onto me, twisting my earlier defiance into the perfect manufactured motive for corporate sabotage. I did not jump out of my chair. I simply clasped my hands together calmly on my desk and looked straight at Bradley without flinching. I was a senior data analyst with a pristine, spotless employment record. The very idea that I would delete a minor retail file out of petty jealousy was completely absurd on its face. Any competent executive would have instantly demanded server logs and proper verification before entertaining such a wild, baseless accusation. But Bradley Carmichael was a desperate fraudster who badly needed a convenient scapegoat, and he needed one fast. Bradley stared at me, his eyes cold, narrow, and calculating. He knew perfectly well that Sloan was lying to cover her own damaged ego and retaliate for the tax report incident. but he also recognized a golden opportunity to exert absolute control over the one employee who had dared to challenge his authority in public. He needed to crush my spirit completely and ensure I remained totally silent about the artificial intelligence algorithms he had stolen from me earlier that very day. "Gemma," he barked, his voice laced with heavy, unmistakable menace. "Get up. Get into my office right now. We are going to have a very serious conversation about your future at this company." I calmly locked my computer screen and walked slowly, deliberately toward his executive suite. I felt the hostile glares of the management team trailing me, following my every step like a swarm of silent vultures. Sloan stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly over her chest, flashing me a triumphant, wicked little smile. I stepped into the sprawling corner office. Bradley followed closely behind me, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the mahogany door, and slammed it shut, engaging the deadbolt lock with a loud, definitive click. The heavy click of that deadbolt echoed unnervingly through the sprawling corner office. Bradley Carmichael turned around, completely and instantly dropping the furious, righteous facade he had just performed so loudly for the entire analytics floor. The mask of a concerned chief executive officer melted away in an instant. He strolled over to his massive mahogany desk, casually straightened his silk tie, and dropped into his high-backed leather chair with the ease of a man who believed he had already won. He did not offer me a seat. He wanted me standing, physically positioned as a subordinate, while he exerted his corporate authority over me from his throne. I stood perfectly still in the center of the plush carpet, maintaining unbroken, direct eye contact. I expected him to launch straight into a tirade about the deleted retail client database, demanding a confession for a crime I did not commit. Instead, Bradley let out a low, cynical chuckle. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a silver pen, and began tapping it rhythmically against his glass desk, almost lazily. "You and I both know you did not delete that file," Bradley stated, his voice now completely devoid of the outrage he had projected so loudly outside. "I know exactly what Sloan did. She is careless, overly emotional, and highly reactive. But her little temper tantrum handed me the perfect pretext to get you behind closed doors without arousing any suspicion from the Human Resources Department." I kept my expression entirely neutral, though my mind was actively, rapidly analyzing every single word he spoke. "So the deleted data is entirely irrelevant to you," I replied evenly, my voice flat. "You are perfectly willing to let your executive assistant sabotage company assets, just to fabricate an excuse to isolate me in your office." Bradley waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away an irritating fly. "A minor retail file is completely meaningless compared to the $50 million acquisition deal currently sitting on the table with Kensington Holdings. That is the only thing that matters today, Gemma, but we have a slight administrative hurdle, and you are going to help me clear it right now." He opened a locked desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I recognized the dense, heavy formatting immediately. It was a comprehensive intellectual property transfer agreement, bundled together with an incredibly aggressive non-disclosure contract. The investment board at Kensington Holdings was absolutely mesmerized by the artificial intelligence predictive models I presented to them this afternoon, Bradley continued, his eyes gleaming with a predatory, desperate greed. "The algorithm you coded is brilliant. It flawlessly mapped out user acquisition in a way that completely blinded their financial analysts to our severe operational deficits. However, their due diligence team will eventually require the official copyright registration for the underlying code before they actually wire the acquisition funds into my accounts." I crossed my arms over my chest, holding my ground without budging an inch. "I own the copyright to that base algorithm," I reminded him, making sure my tone stayed unwavering. I developed the core neural network entirely on my own personal time, using my own equipment, months before I ever integrated it into your company's servers to streamline the workflow. My employment contract clearly stipulates that pre-existing intellectual property remains solely mine. Bradley smiled, and it was a cold, reptilian expression that sent a genuine chill through the room. That is exactly the administrative hurdle I mentioned. You are going to sign over 100% of the copyright for that artificial intelligence model today, and you are going to transfer the legal ownership directly to Sloan. I stared at him, letting the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his demand hang heavy in the silent room. You want me to hand over a multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence algorithm to an executive assistant who cannot even file a basic state tax report properly? Bradley stood up forcefully, leaning his palms flat against his desk, deliberately invading my personal space. Sloan is much more than an assistant, he said, his voice dropping an entire octave into a low, possessive growl. She is a vital part of my personal and professional future. When Kensington Holdings buys this company, I am ensuring she receives a massive payout as a key technical developer. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement for the both of us. You are simply the convenient stepping stone we need to achieve our financial goals. He was openly admitting to corporate fraud, brazenly confirming without a shred of shame that Sloan was his secret mistress. He planned to launder a massive portion of the buyout money directly into her pockets by falsely crediting her with my genius. It was a textbook embezzlement strategy, utterly transparent and incredibly pathetic in its execution. And exactly why would I ever agree to surrender my intellectual property to your mistress? I asked, my voice steady, completely unafraid of his posturing and his theatrics. Because I have the absolute power to completely destroy your life, Bradley threatened, his face flushing dark red with anger at my defiant, disrespectful tone. If you do not sign these papers, I will officially terminate you for gross corporate sabotage. I will use the deleted client database as hard, irrefutable evidence. I will press civil charges and drag you through years of bankrupting litigation until you have nothing left to your name. But that is just the very beginning. I am a highly connected executive in this city. I play golf with the board members of every major tech firm in Chicago. I will place you on a permanent, industry-wide blacklist. I will personally ensure that your professional reputation is so thoroughly toxic that you will never work in data analytics again. You will be a 33-year-old unemployable failure, scraping by on nothing. He walked around the desk and closed the distance between us, looming over me. He truly thought he held all the cards. He thought he was intimidating a helpless middle-class worker who desperately needed her paycheck just to survive. He had absolutely no idea that my African-American brother-in-law, Trey, was a lethal corporate lawyer, currently building an airtight federal case against him, brick by brick. He had absolutely no idea that the billionaire CEO of Kensington Holdings, the very powerful man he was desperately trying to defraud, shared my bed every single night. You are going to walk out of this office with absolutely nothing, Bradley sneered, pointing a rigid finger just inches from my face. You will take the full blame for the deleted files. You will completely surrender the algorithm, and you will disappear quietly, without a sound. If you fight me on this, I will crush your entire career into dust. He retreated back to his desk, grabbed the thick stack of legal documents, and slammed them down violently onto the polished wood surface. The heavy thud echoed sharply through the locked room. He uncapped his expensive silver pen and threw it aggressively on top of the papers. This is a binding non-disclosure agreement and a full copyright transfer, Bradley commanded, his voice dripping with absolute tyrannical authority. You are going to pick up that pen right now, and you are going to sign your name. I stared down at the heavy silver pen resting on top of the aggressively worded non-disclosure agreement. The thick stack of legal documents was a physical manifestation of everything Bradley Carmichael stood for. He stood over me with his arms crossed, his chest puffed out like a peacock. He genuinely believed his loud threats had broken my spirit completely. He thought I was nothing more than a frightened 33-year-old data analyst, facing the total destruction of her livelihood. He expected me to cry, to beg for mercy, and ultimately to sign away my artificial intelligence algorithm just to save my meager salary. I reached toward the desk. Bradley let out a long breath of pure, smug satisfaction. He thought he had successfully stolen the technology needed to trick Kensington Holdings into a $50 million acquisition. He was already picturing the payout he would funnel into offshore accounts. But my fingers bypassed the expensive pen entirely. Instead, I smoothly slid my hand into the pocket of my unbranded skirt and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. "What are you doing?" Bradley snapped, his voice suddenly losing its triumphant edge. "Put that phone away and sign the papers immediately. You are not leaving this room until your signature is on that copyright transfer." I ignored his barking command completely, without so much as a glance up. I unlocked my screen with a biometric scan and opened the custom terminal application I had coded myself, late at night, for exactly this kind of moment. The interface was entirely black, with lines of bright green text rapidly executing automated programming commands across the screen. Prior to walking into his locked office, I had already anticipated exactly what kind of extortion an embezzling CEO would attempt. I had preemptively linked my personal device directly to the secure legal servers managed by my 38-year-old brother-in-law. Trey was not an ordinary attorney by any stretch. As a highly feared African-American corporate lawyer specializing in white-collar crime, his digital infrastructure was fortified to federal law enforcement standards. I tapped the execute button prominently displayed on my screen. A silent, heavily encrypted data packet instantly transmitted across the cellular network. The packet contained a live audio capture of every single threat Bradley had just screamed at me. It also contained a digital scan of the exact metadata attached to the fraudulent non-disclosure agreement currently sitting on his desk, every detail preserved. I locked my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and looked up to meet his furious gaze head-on. I did not show a single ounce of fear. I offered him a slow, dangerously calm and chilling smile. "Mr. CEO," I said, my voice perfectly steady and dripping with razor-sharp precision. "You just sent this coercive threat and this illegal extortion contract to exactly the wrong person." Bradley frowned deeply, his thick eyebrows pulling together in utter confusion. He stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking some incomprehensible foreign language. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his hands clenching slowly into tight, white-knuckled fists. "I have not sent this contract to anyone. The only physical copy in existence is sitting right there on my desk." I stood my ground, my posture projecting absolute, unyielding authority. "You clearly, badly underestimate the technical capabilities of a senior data analyst," I informed him coldly. "Did you honestly believe I would walk blindly into a locked room with a man who is actively embezzling millions of dollars from his own company without establishing a secure digital failsafe first? Every word you just spoke, every single threat you made regarding my career, and your explicit admission that you plan to use my algorithm to funnel acquisition money to Sloan has just been automatically forwarded to an external, heavily fortified server." The color violently drained from his face. The aggressive, flushed red of his anger was instantly replaced by a sickly, terrified, pale hue. He took a stumbling step backward, his polished leather shoes scraping harshly against the expensive carpet beneath him. "You are bluffing," he stammered, though the raw panic widening his eyes completely betrayed his verbal denial. "You are trying to bluff your way out of insubordination. I will have you arrested and prosecuted for corporate espionage. You are in absolutely no position to arrest anyone, I countered smoothly, taking a deliberate step forward to reclaim the physical space he had just abandoned. The secure server currently receiving your audio confession belongs to a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in downtown Chicago. My legal representation now possesses irrefutable recorded evidence of you attempting to extort an employee to facilitate federal wire fraud. If you so much as breathe in the direction of my intellectual property again, my lawyer will deliver that audio file directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission before you can even finish packing your briefcase. Bradley stared at me, his chest heaving heavily as he struggled to process the monumental legal jeopardy he had just willingly walked himself into. The sheer arrogance that had defined his entire career was crumbling into dust right in front of my eyes. He had tried to bully a subordinate and had inadvertently handed a loaded gun straight to a legal executioner. His shock rapidly mutated into a blinding, irrational rage. The veins in his neck bulged dangerously against his tight silk collar. He lunged forward, slamming both of his heavy fists down onto his glass desk with enough force to make the heavy wood frame shudder violently beneath the impact. The silver pen rattled loudly and rolled off the edge onto the floor. He reached blindly for the communication intercom on his desk, smashing his hand against the emergency button that connected directly to the building's security headquarters. Security, get a full extraction team up to the executive suite right now. Bradley roared into the microphone, his voice completely raw and unhinged with sheer naked desperation. He ripped his finger off the button and glared at me, his eyes wide and manic with unchecked fury. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, completely losing whatever remained of his professional sanity. "I will destroy you!" he screamed, the harsh sound echoing violently off the walls of his locked office, bouncing back at him like a curse he could not take back. The morning sun cast long, harsh shadows across the open concept analytics floor at Carmichael Tech. I had arrived at my desk at precisely 8 o'clock, carrying a single cup of black tea and wearing a plain gray wool sweater that had cost less than $50. The tension in the air was already thick enough to suffocate a person. Nobody was speaking. Keyboards clattered with nervous, erratic energy, the sound of fear disguised as productivity. I logged into my dual monitors and checked the encrypted background processes I had left running overnight. Everything was perfectly in place. Trey was systematically tearing through Bradley Carmichael's offshore financial routing numbers, brick by brick. I just needed to sit quietly and play my part in this corporate theater for a little while longer. At exactly 9:15, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite swung open so violently that they slammed against the doorstops with a force that made the whole floor flinch. Sloan marched out onto the floor. She was wearing a blindingly bright yellow designer suit today, clearly dressing to command absolute attention. She clutched a sleek silver tablet in her hands, her knuckles turning white around its edges. She did not walk to her desk. Instead, she stood directly in the center of the room and cleared her throat loudly. "Attention, everyone," Sloan announced, her voice carrying a sharp manufactured edge of panic that immediately silenced the entire room. "We have just received catastrophic news from our financial partners. The company has officially lost our largest retail client account. A contract worth a minimum of $2 million in annual recurring revenue has just been permanently terminated." A collective gasp rippled through the rows of cubicles. Junior analysts looked at each other with wide, terrified eyes, instantly calculating how this massive financial loss would impact the upcoming payroll. Whispers broke out like wildfire, spreading from row to row. $2 million was a fatal blow to a mid-sized software firm already drowning in toxic mounting debt. I kept my face entirely impassive. I knew exactly why that specific account was gone. It was directly tied to the demographic retention database that Sloan had maliciously deleted from the intern server only yesterday afternoon. She had deliberately caused a massive breach of contract, and now they were going to weaponize her own failure against an innocent target. Right on cue, Bradley emerged from his corner office. He looked completely unhinged. His usually immaculate hair was slightly disheveled, and his expensive suit jacket hung unbuttoned and crooked. He marched onto the main floor and stood beside his assistant. He raised his hands, demanding absolute silence from his terrified employees. "I want every single person in this building to gather around the central presentation area right now," Bradley ordered, his voice booming with tyrannical authority. "Drop whatever you are doing. We are having an emergency all-hands meeting immediately." Dozens of employees nervously shuffled out of their cubicles and formed a tight, anxious semicircle around the executive management team. I remained seated in my cheap ergonomic chair for an extra 10 seconds, deliberately refusing to rush to his command before finally standing up and joining the back of the crowd, unhurried. Bradley paced back and forth in front of the large digital presentation board. He glared at the assembled staff, building the dramatic tension before fixing his cold, venomous eyes directly on me. "We are facing a severe corporate crisis today," Bradley began, pointing a rigid finger at the crowd. "And this crisis was not caused by market fluctuations or competitor advancements. It was caused by deliberate, malicious, and criminal sabotage from within our own ranks. We have a traitor standing right here in this room." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, murmuring in shock, eyes darting around nervously. Bradley did not hesitate. He pointed his finger straight at my face, ensuring every single person turned to look at me. "Gemma, step forward right now." I did not break eye contact. I calmly stepped through the parted crowd, my posture perfectly straight, my expression radiating absolute indifference. I stood 10 feet away from him, waiting for the theatrical execution he had clearly planned out in advance. "You are a complete disgrace to the technology industry," Bradley shouted, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. "Yesterday afternoon, you deliberately accessed a junior intern terminal to bypass our internal security protocols. Out of petty, vindictive jealousy over your own mediocre career, you permanently deleted the core retention database for our top-tier retail client. Your gross negligence and intentional corporate sabotage directly caused that client to terminate their $2 million contract this morning. You have single-handedly jeopardized the financial security of every hardworking person in this building." The whispers around me turned into loud mutters of condemnation, growing harsher by the second. The junior staff, entirely ignorant of the truth, looked at me with genuine anger and disgust written across their faces. Bradley was putting on the performance of a lifetime, playing the role of the embattled, righteous chief executive officer protecting his flock from a rogue employee. I simply tilted my head, refusing to defend myself against his ridiculous, fabricated narrative. If I argued now, I would interrupt the perfect digital trap Trey was currently laying for him, thread by careful thread. Bradley took my silence as submission. He puffed out his chest, completely high on his own perceived power. "Therefore, effective immediately, your employment at Carmichael Tech is permanently terminated with extreme cause," Bradley declared loudly. "You are stripped of all corporate access. You will receive absolutely zero severance pay, and your health benefits are canceled as of this hour. But do not think simply losing your job is the end of this nightmare for you. My legal team is already drafting a massive civil lawsuit against you for severe economic damages and breach of fiduciary duty. We are going to sue you for the entire $2 million you just cost this firm. You will be paying off this debt for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. You are completely finished in Chicago." Bradley stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest, his face flushed with arrogant victory. He had successfully shifted the blame for his failing company onto my shoulders, while simultaneously attempting to execute his extortion threat from yesterday afternoon. He looked at Sloan and gave her a sharp nod of approval. Sloan practically vibrated with malicious joy. This was the exact moment she had been waiting for. She stepped forward, a wicked, triumphant smile stretching across her face. She pulled a walkie-talkie from her pocket and spoke into it loudly. "Security, bring the extraction kit to the main analytics floor." A moment later, two large security guards in matching dark uniforms pushed through the crowd of stunned employees. One of them carried a cheap, flattened cardboard box. He snapped it open and dropped it unceremoniously onto my desk. Sloan pointed at the cardboard box, her eyes gleaming with absolute venomous delight. "Pack up your cheap little desk right now, Gemma," she commanded, ensuring her voice carried to every corner of the room. "Put your pathetic belongings in the box and let the guards escort you out the front door like the trash you are. We are all going to stand right here and watch you leave." I did not give them the satisfaction of a physical or emotional reaction. I walked measuredly toward my cubicle, completely ignoring the heavy, intimidating footsteps of the two large security guards flanking my every move. The cheap cardboard box sat squarely in the middle of my desk, looking remarkably pathetic against the expensive ergonomic keyboard I had purchased with my own funds. I began to place my few personal items inside the box with slow, deliberate precision. I packed a ceramic coffee mug, a plain black notebook, and a spare phone charger. I had purposefully left this workspace barren of any personal photographs or identifying markers from the very first day I was hired. I had absolutely no pictures of Liam on display, no hints whatsoever of my actual luxurious life outside these glass corporate walls. My absolute, unwavering calmness seemed to irritate the executive team far more than any hysterical breakdown ever could have. They desperately wanted tears. They wanted begging and pleading. I gave them nothing but cold, mechanical efficiency. Sloan simply could not stand my silence. She strutted over to my cubicle, her designer high heels clicking aggressively against the floor like a weapon being drawn. She began pacing in a tight, predatory circle around my desk, acting exactly like a vulture examining a wounded animal it was certain was already dead. "You really thought you were untouchable, Gemma?" she taunted, her voice shrill and dripping with absolute, unfiltered venom. "Look at you now. Look at this pathetic reality. You are 33 years old, completely single, wearing a clearance rack sweater and packing your entire miserable existence into a recycled cardboard box. You have no husband to support you, no career prospects, and absolutely zero future in this city." She leaned closer, her cloying, overly expensive perfume aggressively invading my personal space. "Who is going to hire a disgraced middle-aged data analyst with a massive corporate sabotage record attached to her name?" Sloan mocked, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across her face. "Absolutely no one. You are going to be out on the cold streets by the end of the month. I bet you will end up living under a bridge downtown, begging strangers for spare change just to buy a hot meal, while I am sitting comfortably in the executive suite managing a $50 million acquisition. This is what happens when you do not know your place. You dared to disrespect me in front of the entire office yesterday. You thought you were so incredibly smart with your boring little numbers and your tax reports. But in the real world, power wins. And you have absolutely no power. You are just a lonely, pathetic spinster who is about to lose everything she has. I carefully placed my notebook into the cardboard box, smoothing down the cover, not even bothering to look up at her twisted, malicious face. I knew that every single word vomiting out of her mouth was cementing her own inevitable destruction, one careless syllable at a time. She was reveling in a temporary, entirely fabricated victory that would not survive the week. Bradley Carmichael decided it was time to step forward and deliver the final crushing blow. He pushed past the two security guards to stand directly over me, towering above my desk. He wanted to make a violent, unforgettable example out of me for the rest of the terrified employees who were actively watching this public corporate execution unfold in real time. "Do not think simply walking out of this building is the end of your punishment," Bradley boomed intentionally, projecting his voice so it echoed across the entire open concept floor. "My elite legal team is currently drafting a comprehensive civil lawsuit against you as we speak. We are suing you for the full $2 million you deliberately cost this firm this morning." He slammed his hand down on the edge of my cubicle wall to emphasize his dominance, the sound sharp and final. "My lawyers are going to freeze your pathetic little bank accounts by tomorrow afternoon," Bradley threatened, his eyes wide with manic authority. "We are going to garnish whatever minimum wage salary you manage to scrape together for the rest of your miserable life. We will seize your meager assets, completely ruin your credit score, and ensure you remain in absolute crushing poverty until the day you die. You will be paying off this massive debt to me forever." He then turned away from me to aggressively address the crowd of junior analysts, using my silent packing routine as a theatrical prop for his intimidation tactics. "Let this be a severe, unforgettable warning to every single person in this room," Bradley declared, gesturing widely with his arms. "This company will not tolerate disloyalty. We will never tolerate internal sabotage. If you cross me, if you dare to threaten the financial stability of Carmichael Tech, I will use every single legal and financial resource at my disposal to completely annihilate your existence. You will be crushed under the massive weight of my legal team." Gemma here thought she could play reckless games with my highly sensitive client data. Now she is going to spend the next 4 decades paying the ultimate price for her arrogance. I picked up my plain black leather tote bag, the exact bag currently concealing my 5-carat diamond engagement ring, and smoothly slung it over my shoulder. I picked up the lightweight cardboard box and stood tall, unbothered. Bradley crossed his arms over his chest, wearing a sickeningly triumphant grin, preparing to order the large security guards to physically march me out into the cold Chicago morning air. But before the security personnel could even take a single step toward me, a deafening, violent crash echoed through the entire room. The massive, heavy glass double doors at the main entrance of the analytics floor were thrown open with such immense explosive force that they slammed fiercely against the reinforced walls behind them. The sound was like a physical strike, instantly silencing Bradley and causing every single person in the crowded room to freeze in absolute shock. A man stepped right through the threshold. He was a tall, powerfully built African-American man possessing an aura of such intense, overwhelming authority that the air in the room seemed to physically drop in temperature around him. He was wearing a flawless, razor-sharp, custom-tailored Tom Ford suit that screamed of exorbitant wealth and lethal corporate power. His polished leather shoes struck the floor with heavy, measured, terrifying precision. He did not say a single word yet, but his mere towering presence instantly suffocated Bradley's arrogant speech, commanding the absolute, undivided attention of every terrified soul in the building. The man who had just shattered the manufactured authority of the analytics floor was Trey. He was 38 years old and the husband of my older sister. But in the corporate warfare arenas of downtown Chicago, he was known simply as the apex predator of business litigation. As an African-American senior partner at one of the most ruthless and elite law firms in the entire country, his presence alone commanded absolute submission from anyone in his path. He strode across the open concept floor with the terrifying, predatory grace of a man who dismantled corrupt billionaires for a living. His custom-tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, radiating an exorbitant, undeniable wealth that made Bradley Carmichael's expensive gray suit look like a cheap knockoff from a discount outlet store. The heavy, measured sound of his polished leather shoes striking the concrete floor echoed through the dead silence of the room. Every single junior analyst, every terrified mid-level manager, and every sycophantic executive instantly held their breath. They did not know his name yet, but they recognized raw, unfiltered power the moment it walked through their front doors. Trey did not spare a single glance at the gaping employees. He did not look at the melting ice sculptures or the pathetic remnants of Sloan's premature celebration. His piercing dark eyes were locked entirely on the two large security guards who were currently flanking my desk. He closed the distance in a matter of seconds, bypassing the stunned crowd with effortless dominance. He came to a halt directly between me and the guards, physically shielding my body with his towering frame. The sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room was palpable, almost suffocating. Trey slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket with one hand, a gesture of casual, terrifying confidence, while his other hand held a thick, densely packed manila envelope. He turned his head infinitesimally toward the security guard on my left. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a deep, resonant baritone that carried the chilling weight of a federal judge issuing a life sentence. If you so much as exhale too heavily in the direction of my client, let alone place a single finger on her physical person or her personal property, I will personally ensure that you are served with a catastrophic civil lawsuit before your shift even ends today. Trey delivered the warning with zero emotion, his tone as cold and hard as solid titanium. I will sue you for unlawful detainment, attempted battery, and tortious interference. I will drain your personal bank accounts, seize your assets, and bury you under so much legal debt that your grandchildren will still be paying off my legal fees decades from now. Step away from her desk immediately. The two security guards who just minutes ago had been eagerly following Sloan's malicious orders, physically recoiled. All the aggressive, intimidating bravado completely drained from their bodies in an instant. They looked at Trey, saw the lethal, uncompromising certainty burning in his eyes, and instantly realized they were standing in the middle of a corporate war zone they were entirely unequipped to handle. Without uttering a single word of protest, both men simultaneously took 3 large steps backward, rapidly putting distance between themselves and my cardboard box. They practically folded into the background, refusing to make eye contact with either Bradley or Sloan. Having neutralized the immediate physical threat, Trey turned his full devastating attention toward the chief executive officer. Bradley was standing frozen near the center of the room, his face a mask of shock and rapidly rising indignation. Trey closed the distance between them, invading Bradley's personal space with calculated, aggressive dominance. He raised his hand and slammed the thick manila envelope down onto the nearest glass table with a violently loud crack that made several junior employees physically flinch. My name is Trey, and I am senior legal counsel representing Gemma in all corporate, civil, and federal matters, he announced, his voice slicing through the stale air of the office like a perfectly sharpened blade. I am formally serving you with an immediate binding cease and desist order regarding any further harassment, defamation, or illegal termination procedures directed at my client. Furthermore, this packet contains a strict spoliation of evidence demand. You are hereby legally barred from altering, deleting, destroying, or tampering with any internal server logs, financial records, or employee communication databases. We are initiating a comprehensive forensic legal hold on every single byte of data inside this entire building. Sloan let out a small, high-pitched gasp. She instinctively took a step backward, hiding slightly behind Bradley's shoulder. The mere mention of a forensic legal hold and the preservation of server logs had instantly triggered her sheer panic. She knew her malicious deletion of the retail client database earlier that morning would be easily uncovered by a professional digital audit. But Bradley was a different breed of narcissist entirely. He was a man who had survived his entire career by bullying his subordinates and faking his financial success. He had spent years ruling this failing tech company with an iron fist, and his fragile, inflated ego simply could not process the fact that someone was openly defying him on his own analytics floor, in full view of his employees. The initial shock that had frozen Bradley's features slowly began to melt away, replaced by a dark, arrogant, and deeply condescending sneer. Standing right in front of him, Bradley's innate superiority complex blinded him completely. He falsely assumed that because I was merely a 33-year-old data analyst wearing a clearance rack sweater, I could not possibly afford top-tier legal representation. He mentally downgraded Trey, instantly categorizing him as a cheap, desperate lawyer hired from some strip mall storefront, someone I had frantically called in a last-ditch effort to save my miserable paycheck. Bradley let out a harsh, abrasive scoff, adjusting his silk tie as he forcibly regained his false swagger. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, tilting his chin up to look down his nose at my brother-in-law. He crossed his arms over his chest, fully embracing his role as the untouchable, tyrannical boss. "You must be joking," Bradley mocked, his voice dripping with heavy, unfiltered contempt as a nasty smirk twisted his lips. "You walk into my company, interrupt my staff meeting, and slam some printed garbage on my table, expecting me to tremble in fear? Let me guess. Gemma found your number on a billboard by the highway. You are just some pathetic, low-rent attorney trying to play the big shot in a real corporate environment, hoping to squeeze a quick settlement out of my firm. You really think a petty, small-time lawyer like you can intimidate a chief executive officer?" Trey did not raise his voice. He did not engage in a petty shouting match with a man who was already, in every meaningful sense, legally dead. When you hold all the cards in a high-stakes corporate war, you do not need to flip the table. Trey simply adjusted the pristine cuffs of his immaculate Tom Ford suit, his dark eyes locking onto Bradley with the terrifying, absolute stillness of an apex predator watching its prey step blindly into a steel trap. The silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating as the chief executive officer's arrogant laughter completely died in his throat. Trey took one slow, deliberate step forward, utterly invading Bradley's personal space with calculated physical dominance. He leaned in, lowering his head just enough so his words would not echo across the entire analytics floor, but keeping his deep baritone voice perfectly calibrated so that Sloan, standing frozen just a few feet away, could hear every single devastating syllable. "Let me clarify a critical financial reality for you, Mr. Carmichael," he whispered, his tone vibrating with lethal, surgical precision. "That $2 million retail account you just publicly accused my client of destroying, it is not missing. It was not deleted by some rogue intern, and it certainly was not lost due to unexpected market fluctuations." Bradley frowned, a flicker of genuine, sudden confusion breaking through his aggressive facade. He opened his mouth to issue another command, but Trey cut him off before he could even draw a breath. Trey did not break eye contact. He delivered the fatal blow with absolute, terrifying calmness. The entire $2 million capital reserve tied to that specific client was manually wired at precisely 2:14 this morning. It successfully bypassed your standard corporate escrow safeguards and was routed directly into a newly established shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. And the sole verified beneficiary of that highly illegal offshore account is standing right behind your left shoulder. Trey shifted his gaze for a fraction of a second, his dark, piercing eyes landing squarely on the 29-year-old executive assistant. "It is registered entirely under Ms. Sloan's personal tax identification numbers." The effect was instantaneous and violently physical. All the vibrant, flushed color instantly drained from Sloan's face, leaving her looking like a chalk-white ghost wrapped in a bright yellow designer suit. Her mouth opened and closed in rapid succession, but her vocal cords were completely paralyzed by sheer terror. She stumbled backward, her expensive high heels suddenly failing to support her weight, until her back hit the edge of a glass conference table. She gripped the edge of the glass, her manicured fingers trembling uncontrollably. Her deepest secret, the massive offshore embezzlement she thought was brilliantly hidden behind complex layers of digital encryption, had just been casually dissected by a man she had never even met before tonight. Bradley physically recoiled as if Trey had just struck him directly in the chest. His eyes darted wildly from the towering corporate lawyer to his trembling assistant, catching the raw, unfiltered guilt radiating from Sloan's terrified posture. The realization that his own corporate fraud was no longer a secret hit him like a massive freight train slamming into a wall. But Bradley Carmichael was a creature of pure, unadulterated hubris. Even when backed into a lethal legal corner, his massive, fragile ego simply refused to surrender. Instead of recognizing the catastrophic jeopardy he was now in, his survival instinct triggered a blind, furious, and highly irrational counterattack. Bradley abruptly straightened his posture, forcefully shoving his panic deep down into his chest. He jutted his chin forward, his face twisting into a mask of desperate, aggressive superiority. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Bradley spat out, his voice shaking with a volatile mixture of fear and rage. "You think pulling up some fabricated fake bank records changes anything in the real world? It changes absolutely nothing. You have no idea the kind of monumental power I am about to wield in this city. You are standing in a company that is less than 7 days away from a complete structural metamorphosis." Bradley pointed a rigid finger at Trey, practically vibrating with arrogant delusion. "Next week, this entire firm is being officially acquired by Kensington Holdings. We are signing a massive, binding $50 million buyout contract. I'm going to have the absolute, undivided financial backing of the most powerful billionaire in Chicago. When that ink dries, my corporate resources will be virtually limitless. I will deploy a fleet of elite, high-priced attorneys who will grind your pathetic little law firm into dust. I will ensure that both you and your client are sued into absolute, crushing bankruptcy. You will be stripped of your legal license, and Gemma will be paying me severe economic damages for the rest of her miserable, pathetic life. You cannot touch me. I am about to be completely untouchable." The entire open concept floor was dead silent. The junior analysts watched with bated breath, entirely convinced by the sheer volume of their boss's threats. They genuinely believed Bradley was about to ascend to the highest tier of corporate wealth, bringing the wrath of a billionaire down upon anyone who dared to cross him. I stood quietly beside my desk, listening to Bradley weaponize my own husband's company against my legal counsel. The absolute blinding irony of the situation was almost intoxicating. Bradley Carmichael was aggressively threatening to use Liam Kensington's money to destroy Liam Kensington's own wife. It was a spectacular, monumental display of self-destructive ignorance, the kind that would make a perfect case study someday. Trey did not flinch. He did not blink. The aggressive, desperate threats washed over him like water sliding off solid granite. A slow, chilling, and utterly victorious smirk curled the corner of Trey's lips. It was the smile of a man who had just watched his opponent willingly walk right off the edge of a steep cliff, arms still flailing in triumph. Trey casually adjusted his briefcase, his dark eyes gleaming with absolute predatory anticipation. "Is that so?" Trey replied softly, his deep voice carrying a dark, razor-sharp amusement that sent a visible shiver down Sloan's spine. Trey turned slightly, offering me his arm with flawless, gentlemanly grace. I picked up my plain tote bag, leaving the cheap cardboard box exactly where it sat, abandoned on the desk. "Well then, Mr. Carmichael," Trey said, looking back over his shoulder to deliver the final devastating hook. "I suppose we will just have to see you at the signing gala next week. Let us see exactly how untouchable you really are." I took Trey's offered arm, keeping my head held high, my posture radiating absolute, unshakable power. Without sparing another glance at the pale, panicking chief executive officer or his trembling assistant, we turned our backs on the silent analytics floor. We walked toward the heavy glass double doors, our footsteps echoing with perfect, synchronized precision, leaving the toxic, crumbling company far behind us. The week leading up to the highly anticipated acquisition gala moved with a quiet, lethal precision. I did not return to the Carmichael Tech office after that explosive confrontation. Instead, I spent my days working from the sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse I shared with Liam in the heart of downtown Chicago. My temporary desk in a cramped, noisy cubicle was immediately replaced by a massive slab of custom Italian marble overlooking the stunning city skyline. While Bradley and his arrogant assistant were undoubtedly popping more cheap champagne and planning their fraudulent offshore retirements, my brother-in-law and I were meticulously weaving an inescapable legal net around them. Trey and his elite team of forensic accountants worked around the clock without pause. We traced every single stolen dollar through the complex digital labyrinth Sloan had built. We mapped out the entire network of Cayman Island shell corporations registered under fake vendor aliases. We had the wire fraud evidence secured on federal-grade servers, triple backed up and untouchable. All that remained was the final, devastating execution of our trap. On Thursday morning, just 2 days before the massive celebration at the Ritz-Carlton, my personal laptop chimed with an incoming high-priority email. It was routed through the official Carmichael Tech executive server, but the deeply condescending tone of the subject line instantly gave away the sender. It read, "Mandatory attendance required for termination processing." I clicked open the message, taking a slow, calming sip of my perfectly brewed morning tea. The body of the email was a masterpiece of petty corporate bullying, drafted entirely by a woman drunk on fake borrowed power. She had clearly spent hours agonizing over the exact wording, ensuring maximum psychological humiliation with every line. "Gemma," the email began, completely lacking any standard professional greeting or basic respect. "As you are acutely aware, your employment was terminated for gross misconduct and severe internal sabotage. However, the Human Resources Department cannot officially release your final minimum wage paycheck or your necessary severance paperwork until you complete your final mandatory corporate obligation. We are hosting the Kensington Holdings Acquisition Gala this Saturday evening at the Ritz-Carlton. Since you maliciously cost this company a $2 million retail account, you will work off a tiny fraction of your massive debt by serving as the frontline greeting and coat check attendant for our elite guests. You are strictly required to stand at the rear service entrance for the entire duration of the event. You will smile, you will take heavy winter coats, and you will absolutely not speak to any of the billionaire investors. If you fail to appear for this mandatory service shift, I will personally ensure your final paycheck is withheld indefinitely. Furthermore, your termination papers will reflect criminal sabotage, effectively destroying your chances of ever collecting unemployment benefits in this state. Wear a plain black uniform. Do not embarrass us further." I sat back in my plush velvet chair and stared at the glowing screen. The sheer, blinding audacity of the demand was almost too spectacular to comprehend, almost admirable in its delusion. She actually believed she held the ultimate leverage over my life. She genuinely thought I was a desperate, financially ruined 33-year-old woman who needed a final, meager paycheck just to avoid eviction. She wanted to parade her perceived victory right in my face. She wanted me forced to stand in the cold shadows like a servant holding coats while she twirled around the luxury ballroom, pretending to be the brilliant architect of a $50 million tech acquisition. She desperately wanted to break my pride in front of the very people she thought she was impressing. I heard the soft, heavy tread of footsteps approaching from the master hallway. Liam walked into the home office wearing a dark, custom-tailored suit, looking every bit the devastatingly handsome and utterly ruthless private equity titan that he was. He leaned over my shoulder, resting his large hands on the back of my chair, and his sharp eyes scanned the aggressive email displayed on my monitor. A low, dark chuckle rumbled deep in his chest. Are they seriously trying to extort the chief due diligence officer of my investment firm by holding a $2,000 paycheck hostage? Liam asked, his voice dripping with pure predatory amusement. Bradley and his little assistant are truly living in a magnificent, spectacular delusion. They are inviting the executioner directly to their own execution, and they are demanding that she check their coats at the door on her way in. I tilted my head back to look at my powerful husband. They want me standing at the service entrance watching them celebrate their massive corporate fraud, I told him, a slow, dangerous smile curling my lips. They want to humiliate me one final time before they try to take your money and run. Liam leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the side of my head. His eyes gleamed with the exact same lethal anticipation that was currently coursing through my veins. Then I highly suggest you accept their gracious invitation, my love, he murmured. Give them exactly what they asked for. We would hate to disappoint our hosts on such a monumentally important evening. I turned my attention back to the keyboard. I did not write a lengthy, defensive reply. I did not argue about corporate policy or threaten immediate legal action. I simply hit the reply button, typed a single, definitive word, and hit send. Agreed. The transition from an undercover data analyst back to a billionaire's wife required a specific, meticulous kind of warfare preparation. On the evening of the gala, the atmosphere inside our penthouse master suite felt incredibly electric, charged with quiet anticipation. I was not putting on a cheap clearance rack sweater or sensible flat shoes today. I was preparing to deliver a fatal corporate blow, and my armor needed to reflect absolute, untouchable power. I sat perfectly still in the center of my massive, brightly lit dressing room. A team of 3 elite, highly sought-after styling professionals swirled around me with practiced, synchronized efficiency. The lead makeup artist carefully blended a flawless, razor-sharp contour across my cheekbones, applying a deep, striking crimson lipstick that screamed of pure, unadulterated authority. A master hairstylist pinned my dark hair into an intricate, elegant updo that exposed the long, graceful line of my neck. They worked in absolute silence, understanding somehow the gravity of the transformation taking place before them. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The tired, unassuming analyst who had quietly endured months of blatant disrespect and corporate bullying was completely gone, erased entirely. The woman staring back at me possessed cold, calculating eyes and a chilling aura of absolute supremacy. The stage was perfectly set, the trap was fully armed, and the people who had mocked me had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a spectacle of manufactured luxury. Bradley Carmichael had spared absolutely no expense for this acquisition gala, completely draining the final reserves of the company's accounts to fund an evening of pure, deceitful extravagance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the imported floral arrangements and the towering champagne pyramids. A string quartet played softly in the background, providing an elegant soundtrack for the corporate lies being exchanged on the floor below. Outside the hotel, a massive red carpet stretched from the grand entrance down to the valet drop-off zone. Flashbulbs from local business reporters and hired photographers illuminated the crisp Chicago night air. Bradley stood at the very top of the red carpet stairs, playing the role of the triumphant tech visionary. He wore a rented designer tuxedo that he hoped projected billion-dollar confidence. Beside him stood his 29-year-old executive assistant. Sloan had squeezed herself into an incredibly flashy sequined silver gown that screamed of newly acquired, unearned wealth. She was practically vibrating with arrogant excitement, clinging tightly to Bradley's arm and flashing broad, rehearsed smiles for the cameras. She was fully embracing her delusion, acting as if she were the guest of honor rather than an embezzling mistress about to face federal indictment. They were eagerly awaiting the arrival of the Kensington Holdings executive team, entirely unaware that the executioner they were waiting to impress had already been on their payroll for 2 full years. At exactly 8 o'clock, the chaotic murmur of the valet area suddenly died down. A sleek, midnight black Maybach polished to a mirror shine glided smoothly up the curved driveway. The vehicle radiated an aura of raw, untouchable power that instantly commanded the attention of every single guest, reporter, and hotel staff member present. The sheer, intimidating presence of the flagship luxury car made the other expensive vehicles in the valet line look like cheap toys parked beside it. Whispers immediately broke out across the red carpet. The junior analysts and mid-level managers from Carmichael Tech, who had been more or less forced to attend just to make the crowd look larger, stretched their necks to get a glimpse. Everyone assumed the billionaire CEO Liam Kensington had finally arrived to officially sign the $50 million buyout. Bradley hastily adjusted his bow tie and nudged Sloan, signaling her to prepare for the ultimate corporate groveling session. They both pasted on their most sycophantic, eager smiles, ready to bow down to the wealth they desperately wanted to steal for themselves. A highly trained, impeccably dressed chauffeur stepped out of the driver's seat and walked briskly around the rear of the Maybach. He reached for the heavy silver door handle and pulled it open with practiced, absolute precision. But it was not my billionaire husband who stepped out onto the pavement. I placed one foot, clad in a custom crystal-embellished stiletto, onto the red carpet. I rose from the plush leather interior of the luxury vehicle and stood to my full height. The cold Chicago wind caught the flowing fabric of my dress, and a collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd. I was wearing a breathtaking, custom-fitted Oscar de la Renta evening gown that had cost a staggering $15,000. The deep, rich, emerald green silk draped perfectly across my figure, radiating an old-money elegance that completely eclipsed the flashy, desperate silver sequin Sloan was wearing. The exquisite tailoring emphasized a posture of absolute, unyielding authority. I was no longer hiding behind oversized clearance rack sweaters or sensible flat shoes. Around my neck rested a vintage, flawless diamond collar, catching the flashing lights of the cameras and throwing blinding, brilliant refractions across the hotel entrance. On my left hand, the 5-carat custom diamond engagement ring I had kept hidden in my plain tote bag for 2 entire years was finally on full, magnificent display. I looked like royalty stepping onto a battlefield. The tired 33-year-old data analyst who had been publicly humiliated in the company cafeteria was entirely erased from existence, replaced by something else entirely. I was the living, breathing embodiment of absolute financial supremacy. The photographers, completely captivated by the sheer, undeniable power of my arrival, began snapping pictures in a rapid, blinding frenzy. They did not know my name yet, but their professional instincts recognized a woman who owned the room before she even crossed its threshold. The reaction from my former coworkers was absolutely priceless. The junior staff members who had watched me pack a cheap cardboard box just days ago were standing near the velvet ropes, their jaws literally dropping open in sheer, unadulterated shock. They blinked rapidly, desperately trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, bullied employee with the devastatingly gorgeous elite titan currently commanding the red carpet. They nudged each other, pointing and whispering furiously, completely paralyzed by the impossible transformation unfolding right before their eyes. At the top of the stairs, The arrogant, triumphant smiles completely vanished from the faces of the executive team. Bradley stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his brain utterly failing to process the visual information flooding his senses. The color rapidly drained from his face, replaced by a deep, sickly shade of absolute panic. He recognized the emerald gown, the blinding diamonds, and the undeniable aura of untouchable wealth radiating from every inch of my presence. He suddenly realized that the woman he had aggressively threatened and attempted to extort was not a helpless subordinate, but someone who operated in a financial stratosphere he could never even dream of reaching. But while Bradley stood frozen in terror, Sloan experienced a completely different reaction. Her fragile, manufactured reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. The spotlight she had so desperately craved, the evening she had meticulously planned to celebrate her own fraudulent victory, had just been effortlessly stolen by the very woman she had spent weeks tormenting. The sight of me draped in $15,000 of pure Oscar de la Renta silk, dripping in authentic diamonds and emerging from a multi-million-dollar Maybach, was a direct and fatal blow to her massive ego. Pure, blinding jealousy and unfiltered rage violently contorted Sloane's face. She lost every single ounce of her fabricated corporate decorum. Her hands clenched into tight, shaking fists, and her chest heaved with shallow, furious breaths. She could not accept being upstaged. She refused to let the woman she considered a pathetic failure command the attention of the entire gala. With a sharp, ugly snarl, Sloan ripped her arm away from Bradley's grasp. She completely abandoned her post at the top of the stairs and stomped aggressively down the red carpet, her cheap silver sequins flashing erratically as she marched straight toward me, her eyes blazing with absolute venom, determined to physically block my path and enforce the humiliating service entrance mandate she had emailed me. Sloan closed the distance between us with aggressive, heavy steps that made the cheap silver sequins of her dress catch the flashing lights of the cameras in a chaotic, desperate display. She threw her arms out wide, physically blocking my path on the pristine red carpet. Her face was flushed with a toxic mixture of blinding jealousy and pure, unadulterated panic. She simply could not comprehend how the woman she had mercilessly bullied just days ago was currently eclipsing her entirely. The spotlight she had so desperately craved for this evening had been effortlessly stolen. "What do you think you are doing here?" Sloan shrieked, her voice pitching so high it sounded like shattering glass. She did not care that local business reporters were actively snapping photographs of her total meltdown. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You were specifically ordered to stand at the service entrance in a plain black uniform. You are supposed to be checking coats, not parading around the main entrance like some kind of fraudulent celebrity. Get out of my sight before I have you thrown in jail." I simply looked down at her trembling, pointing finger, maintaining an expression of absolute, chilling indifference. My silence only fueled her manic, uncontrollable outrage. "Where did you steal that dress?" Sloan demanded, her voice echoing loudly across the valet drop-off zone. There is absolutely no way a fired 33-year-old data analyst who cannot even afford her rent could possibly pay for an authentic designer gown. Did you rent that luxury car with stolen company funds? Are you trying to blackmail us right now? Security. I need hotel security right now. Two large, uniformed hotel security guards immediately stepped out from the grand entrance, looking highly alarmed by the escalating confrontation. Sloan waved them down frantically, her face twisted in an ugly snarl. "Remove this woman from the premises immediately," she ordered them with a furious wave of her hand. "She is a disgruntled, terminated employee who is trespassing on a private corporate event. She came here to extort the executive team." Sloan turned her venomous glare back to me, taking a step closer, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. You have absolutely no right to be here. We are hosting the most elite investment firm in Chicago tonight. You are a complete and utter failure, Gemma. You do not even have the right to breathe the same air as a billionaire like Liam Kensington. When he arrives here to sign our $50 million contract, he will be completely disgusted by your pathetic, desperate presence. You are nothing but trash trying to ruin my perfect night. Before I could even issue a response to her magnificent display of sheer ignorance, Bradley Carmichael hurried down the red carpet stairs. He was sweating profusely, his face pale and slick under the bright, flashing lights. He desperately needed to maintain control of the situation before the Kensington Holdings executive team arrived. He could see the reporters murmuring and writing down notes, capturing the entire humiliating spectacle with obvious relish. Bradley stepped up beside his mistress, his eyes darting frantically between my flawless diamond collar and the approaching security personnel. "What is the meaning of this nonsense?" Bradley hissed, trying to keep his voice low but failing to mask his raw, unfiltered panic. "I told you that your career was over. You think showing up to my acquisition gala in a stolen dress is going to change anything? You are making a massive, catastrophic mistake, and I will make sure you rot in a prison cell for corporate espionage." He turned to the hotel security guards, his tone shifting into a harsh, tyrannical command. "Grab her arms and forcefully escort her off this property right this second. If she resists, call the local police and have her arrested for criminal trespassing and corporate harassment. I want her removed from my site before the buyers arrive. I am not going to let a mentally unstable ex-employee ruin the biggest financial deal of my entire life." The two security guards exchanged hesitant glances. They looked at Bradley in his rented tuxedo, and then they looked at my $15,000 silk gown and the towering, unshakable power radiating from my posture. They were professionally trained to handle unruly guests, but their instincts warned them that touching me would be a monumental error. However, Bradley was the corporate client paying for the grand ballroom, so they slowly began to advance toward me. Their large hands reached out, preparing to grab my shoulders and physically drag me away from the bright lights of the red carpet. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground on the red carpet with the absolute, terrifying stillness of a queen watching a peasant rebellion crumble. I locked eyes with the closest security guard, delivering a silent, freezing warning that made him hesitate for a fraction of a second. I was perfectly prepared to let them make the final, fatal mistake of placing their hands on the wife of the most powerful man in the city. I wanted Bradley and Sloan to feel the absolute peak of their false victory before the entire foundation of their lives collapsed into dust. Right at that exact moment, before the guard could even brush the silk fabric of my sleeve, the deep, heavy roar of multiple high-performance engines completely drowned out the ambient noise of the street. A massive, heavily armored convoy of matte black sport utility vehicles aggressively turned into the hotel driveway, their tires screeching sharply against the pavement. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the motorcade instantly paralyzed everyone on the red carpet. The flashing lights of the cameras reflected off the tinted, bulletproof windows. The lead vehicle stopped abruptly, perfectly cutting off the security guards. The heavy, reinforced doors of the vehicles swung wide open simultaneously, releasing a highly trained detail of elite, dark-suited protection agents who rapidly secured the perimeter. The heavy steel doors of the lead vehicle opened with synchronized precision. A towering figure stepped out onto the red carpet, completely eclipsing the chaotic flashing lights of the desperate photographers. It was Liam Kensington. He was 36 years old and the undisputed titan of the Chicago private equity sector. He did not simply walk into a room. He conquered it by merely existing within its borders. He wore a flawless midnight black bespoke tuxedo that draped over his broad, athletic frame with dangerous perfection. The crisp, stark white of his tailored shirt contrasted sharply against the dark fabric, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying financial supremacy. His jawline was rigid, carved from solid granite, and his piercing dark eyes swept over the crowded valet area with the cold, calculating detachment of an apex predator assessing a deeply inferior landscape. A flank of highly trained, broad-shouldered protection agents immediately formed a tight, impenetrable perimeter around him. They moved with silent, lethal efficiency, their dark suits and earpieces broadcasting a clear, undeniable warning to anyone foolish enough to step out of line. The sheer magnitude of his arrival completely shattered the fragile, manufactured reality that Bradley Carmichael had tried so desperately to construct for this evening. The frantic murmurs of the junior staff and the aggressive shouting of the local press abruptly died in their throats. The atmosphere plummeted to freezing temperatures. Everyone present held their breath, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming gravity of a man who could dismantle entire corporate empires with a single casual signature. Bradley stood frozen at the top of the stairs for exactly 2 seconds before the realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The absolute pinnacle of his corporate aspirations, the multi-billion-dollar savior of his rapidly sinking company, had finally arrived. Bradley entirely forgot about the 2 security guards he had just ordered to violently remove me. He completely erased my existence from his panicked, greedy mind. He hastily grabbed the lapels of his rented tuxedo, desperately attempting to smooth out the wrinkles he had created during his earlier temper tantrum. His face, which had been flushed with toxic rage just moments ago, suddenly morphed into a pathetic, desperate mask of overwhelming subservience. Sloan reacted with the exact same sickening desperation. She frantically patted down her cheap sequined silver dress, her eyes widening with manic, starry-eyed delusion. She genuinely believed this was her moment to ascend to the highest tier of society. She thought she was about to stand shoulder to shoulder with the financial elite of the city. Bradley shoved his way past his own terrified employees and aggressively pushed through the line of flashing cameras, determined to be the very first person to greet the billionaire. Sloan followed right on his heels, practically sprinting down the red carpet in her high heels, determined to position herself directly in Liam's line of sight. "Mr. Kensington!" Bradley practically shouted, his voice cracking slightly as he rushed forward with his hand eagerly extended for a welcoming shake. "It is an absolute and profound honor to welcome you to our acquisition gala this evening. We have been eagerly awaiting your arrival. I am Bradley Carmichael, the Chief Executive Officer of this firm, and I have personally overseen every single detail to ensure this night meets your exacting standards." Sloan stepped up right next to him, thrusting her chest forward and flashing a wide, highly practiced, completely artificial smile. "And I am his executive assistant," she chimed in, her voice dripping with a cloying, desperate sweetness. "We have the VIP suite perfectly prepared for your private signing ceremony. We are so incredibly thrilled to finalize our new partnership with Kensington Holdings." They stood there on the red carpet, 2 pathetic, embezzling fraudsters, eagerly offering themselves up to a man who held the absolute power to destroy them. They waited with bated breath, expecting Liam to grasp their hands, praise their innovative company, and validate their entire miserable existence. Liam did not slow his stride. He did not extend his hand. He did not even grant them the basic human courtesy of a passing glance. As Bradley eagerly stepped into his path, Liam's facial expression remained entirely locked in a mask of cold, terrifying indifference. He treated the chief executive officer of Carmichael Tech exactly like a meaningless, invisible piece of debris cluttering up the pristine red carpet. Without missing a single beat, the lead protection agent stepped smoothly in front of Liam. The massive, dark-suited bodyguard raised one heavy, unyielding arm and forcefully shoved Bradley directly in the chest. The physical rejection was swift, brutal, and completely humiliating. Bradley stumbled backward, his polished shoes slipping on the carpet as he collided heavily with a velvet stanchion. His extended hand dropped to his side, his face contorting in pure, unadulterated shock. Sloan let out a sharp gasp and instinctively leaped out of the way, plastering her back against the nearest wall to avoid being trampled by the advancing wall of elite security personnel. Liam walked right past their stumbling, humiliated forms as if they were entirely non-existent. The protective detail parted the sea of stunned reporters and frozen corporate employees, clearing a direct, unobstructed path straight toward the center of the entrance. Every single camera lens pivoted. Every single eye in the crowded valet area followed the billionaire's trajectory, desperately trying to understand what had just happened. The most powerful man in Chicago had just publicly and violently rejected the host of the gala, and he was currently marching with laser-focused, lethal intent straight toward the woman who had been moments away from being forcibly ejected from the premises. The two hotel security guards who were standing mere inches from me instantly backed away, their faces turning ghost white as the flanks of bodyguards descended upon our position. They realized with absolute crushing certainty that they had been seconds away from making a fatal, career-ending mistake. I stood perfectly still in my $15,000 emerald silk gown, the vintage diamond collar resting cool against my collarbone as it caught the ambient light of the hotel entrance. I watched my husband approach, completely unfazed by the chaotic, swirling energy of the terrified crowd surrounding us. As Liam reached me, the terrifying glacial aura that had completely suffocated the red carpet vanished in a heartbeat. The hard, ruthless lines of his jaw softened instantly. His dark, piercing eyes, which had just looked through Bradley Carmichael like empty glass, suddenly melted into a pool of profound, unconditional, and overwhelming devotion. He stepped into my personal space, completely ignoring the hundreds of wide-eyed, petrified onlookers, the flashing cameras, and the deeply confused corporate executives. He reached out with his large, warm hands and gently cupped the sides of my face. The absolute tenderness of his touch was a jarring, spectacular contrast to the violent, untouchable power he had projected just moments prior. He leaned down, closing his eyes, and pressed a long, incredibly soft kiss directly onto my forehead. The gesture was so deeply intimate, so fiercely protective, that a collective and completely stunned silence fell over the entire grand entrance. Liam pulled back just enough to look deeply into my eyes. His thumbs gently stroked my cheekbones. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, smooth rumble that carried effortlessly across the dead, silent crowd, ensuring every single person heard his devastating words clearly. "Sorry, darling. I am late," Liam murmured, his tone shifting into a dark, razor-sharp edge as his gaze flicked momentarily toward the pale, trembling figures of Bradley and Sloan. "Is this trash bothering you?" The silence that slammed down over the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom was absolute and entirely suffocating. It was a complete structural collapse of reality for the people who had spent the last 48 hours actively plotting my destruction. Hundreds of elite guests, corporate executives, and terrified junior analysts stood frozen like marble statues. No one dared to take a single breath. The only sound that broke the heavy vacuum was the sharp, violent shatter of fine crystal. Sloan had been holding a full glass of expensive red vintage wine, eagerly waiting to toast her fraudulent victory. When Liam uttered those devastating words, her manicured fingers gave out entirely. The delicate glass slipped from her grasp and exploded against the polished marble floor. The dark red liquid splashed violently across the tips of her cheap silver-sequined dress, looking exactly like fresh blood spreading across a crime scene. Sloan did not even look down at the ruined fabric. All the vibrant color had been siphoned from her face, leaving her with a sickly, ashen pallor. Her mouth hung open in a silent, agonizing scream of pure realization. The glamorous lifestyle she had so meticulously mapped out evaporated into thin air. Bradley Carmichael fared significantly worse. The 45-year-old chief executive officer began to physically tremble. The aggressive, tyrannical swagger that had defined his entire miserable career abandoned him completely. He looked from the towering presence of Liam Kensington to the $15,000 emerald silk gown draping my figure. His brain aggressively short-circuited, entirely failing to process the impossible situation unfolding before him. He opened his mouth, his jaw working frantically up and down, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single coherent syllable. He managed a pathetic, breathless wheeze, taking a staggering step backward as if an invisible physical force had just struck him clean across the chest. Liam offered me a slow, deeply respectful nod, a silent communication between a husband and wife who operated as equal partners in both life and corporate warfare. He smoothly stepped back just half a pace, deliberately yielding the center stage directly to me. He positioned his tall, imposing frame just over my right shoulder, standing as a massive, untouchable shield while I prepared to deliver the execution. I turned my body away from the protective embrace of my husband and faced the crumbling CEO. The last remaining traces of the quiet, compliant data analyst vanished from my posture entirely. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin with the cold authority of a woman who held total dominion over the financial sector. I looked Bradley dead in the eyes. I watched the raw, unfiltered terror swimming in his pupils. "You look incredibly confused, Bradley," I stated. My voice was no longer flat or accommodating. It rang out across the silent ballroom, clear and razor-sharp, cutting through the stagnant air like a perfectly aimed scalpel. "Allow me to clear up this catastrophic misunderstanding for you. I am not a desperate 33-year-old woman begging for minimum wage. I am not an expendable asset you can throw out onto the street, and I am certainly not a helpless subordinate you can lock in an office and extort for intellectual property." Bradley shook his head weakly, his polished leather shoes scraping uselessly against the floor. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a shaking finger toward Liam, then back toward me. "Wife," he stammered out the single word, sounding like a dry, choked sob. "Wife. You cannot be. You are just Gemma. You are just a coder." I offered him a smile entirely devoid of warmth or mercy. "My name is Gemma Kensington," I declared, ensuring the heavy, powerful surname echoed off the crystal chandeliers above us. "I am the legal wife of Liam Kensington. We have been happily married for over 3 years, but my marital status is actually the least of your immediate concerns tonight. My position as a billionaire's spouse is not what is currently destroying your company. My professional title is what you should be absolutely terrified of right now." I took one deliberate, agonizingly slow step forward, forcing Bradley to cower backward into the velvet ropes. "I am the Chief Due Diligence Officer for Kensington Holdings," I announced, projecting my voice so the local business reporters near the entrance could capture every damning word. "My primary corporate function is to aggressively audit and dismantle potential acquisition targets before our investment board authorizes a single dollar of funding. I do not rely on polished executive summaries. I rely on raw, empirical truth. Therefore, exactly 6 months ago, I personally embedded myself inside Carmichael Tech under the guise of a senior data analyst. I instituted a covert operational review of your entire organizational structure. I spent half a year sitting in a cramped cubicle, drinking terrible break-room coffee, and quietly monitoring every single transaction, every internal email, and every fraudulent projection you fabricated. The collective gasp that erupted from the gathered Carmichael Tech employees was deafening. The junior staff members who had watched me quietly type away at my desk suddenly realized they had been working beside a high-ranking corporate spy directly evaluating every aspect of their livelihood. Sloan let out a high-pitched whimper. Her knees finally buckled under the crushing weight of her own hubris, and she sank onto the plush carpet, clutching the sides of her cheap silver dress. She knew with absolute certainty that if I had been monitoring the company for 6 months, I had seen everything. "You thought you were a brilliant mastermind, Bradley," I continued. I turned my head slightly, my eyes scanning the perimeter of the shocked crowd. I found exactly who I was looking for. Standing behind the wall of elite protection agents, looking immaculate in his dark suit and holding a secure digital tablet, was my brother-in-law. I raised my hand and issued a definitive signal. "Trey," I commanded smoothly, "please step up to the main audiovisual podium. It is time to show our guests the real numbers." Trey moved with the absolute precision of a seasoned predator closing in for the final kill. He stepped out from the protective wall of my husband's security detail and walked directly toward the main audiovisual podium situated at the front of the grand ballroom. The entire venue remained locked in a suffocating silence. Even the string quartet had long since stopped playing, their bows hovering frozen over their instruments. The elite guests, the prominent shareholders, and the terrified junior staff members simply parted to let the towering corporate lawyer pass. Trey did not hesitate. He pulled a secure, heavily encrypted tablet from his tailored suit jacket and connected it directly into the primary presentation console. The massive, high-definition LED screens flanking the ballroom stage flickered violently. These were the exact same screens Bradley had rented to proudly display the fake, bloated financial projections of his failing company. Instead, the bright, cheerful corporate logos vanished into complete darkness. They were instantly replaced by stark, glaring white financial spreadsheets, complex data routing maps, and heavily redacted banking statements. The harsh light from the screens bathed the opulent ballroom in a cold, clinical glow, transforming the luxurious celebration into a devastating federal tribunal. I kept my position right beside Liam, feeling the solid, radiating heat of his protective presence behind me. I raised my hand and gestured toward the towering screens, commanding the attention of every single person in the room. "What you are looking at right now is not the glorious, highly profitable tech firm Bradley Carmichael promised you," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy air with zero mercy. "Yesterday afternoon, your chief executive officer physically snatched a proprietary artificial intelligence report directly from my hands. He stole my custom-coded predictive algorithms and shamelessly presented them to the Kensington Holdings Investment Board. He actively attempted to use my own intellect to inflate the valuation of this rapidly sinking company. He thought he could casually mask a catastrophic operational deficit by flashing my own brilliant mathematics in front of my husband." A wave of disgusted murmurs ripped through the crowd of wealthy investors. The Kensington Holdings board members who had been invited to attend this gala stared at Bradley with expressions of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The sheer audacity of his intellectual property theft was staggering, but it was merely the opening act of his corporate execution. I nodded to my brother-in-law. Trey tapped the screen of his tablet and the massive displays behind me shifted instantly. The complex algorithm charts were replaced by a chaotic, branching web of offshore financial routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, and digital banking logs. Trey picked up the microphone from the podium. When he spoke, his deep, resonant baritone echoed off the crystal chandeliers, carrying the chilling, absolute authority of a federal prosecutor delivering a death sentence. "We initiated a stealth forensic audit of the Carmichael Tech internal ledgers precisely 24 hours ago," Trey declared, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the shareholders. My team of legal analysts completely bypassed the fabricated surface-level balance sheets. We dug directly into the raw, unfiltered server transaction logs. What we discovered was not simply gross corporate mismanagement or negligent cash burn. We uncovered a massive, deliberate, and highly coordinated syndicate of federal wire fraud. Trey swiped his finger across the tablet. A specific, glaringly highlighted banking transaction magnified on the screens, displaying a staggering numerical figure. Over the past 3 fiscal quarters, Bradley Carmichael has systematically embezzled exactly $4.2 million from this corporation, Trey stated, his voice ringing with lethal clarity. But he did not simply siphon this money from the operational budget or the venture capital reserves. He was far more malicious than that. He authorized the manual extraction of these funds directly from the employee pension accounts. He stole the retirement savings, the healthcare reserves, and the financial futures of every single hardworking junior analyst and mid-level manager standing in this room today. The reaction was instantaneous and violently emotional. The Carmichael Tech employees, the very people who had been forced to attend this gala under the threat of termination, gasped in collective, horrified shock. Several junior analysts covered their mouths, their eyes welling with tears of profound betrayal. The managers who had sycophantically praised Bradley just yesterday now glared at him with unfiltered, murderous rage. He had not just ruined the company, he had actively robbed them blind to fund his own pathetic, arrogant lifestyle. And the destination of those stolen pension funds is equally damning, Trey continued, refusing to let the crowd recover their breath. He tapped the screen one final time. The complex web of offshore routing numbers consolidated into a single, undeniable destination point. The screens boldly displayed the official registration documents for a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands. Right beneath the corporate entity name were the personal tax identification numbers and the digital signature of the sole beneficiary. Every single stolen dollar was routed through encrypted channels and deposited directly into the personal offshore accounts of Ms. Sloan, Trey announced, his dark eyes locking onto the trembling, pale assistant. The $4.2 million stolen from your retirement funds paid for her luxury vacations, her offshore investments, and the silver-sequined designer dress she is currently wearing tonight. Bradley Carmichael bled this company dry to finance the extravagant lifestyle of his secret mistress. The sheer weight of the irrefutable evidence crashed down upon the ballroom like a concrete vault. There was absolutely no room for denial, no space for a fabricated defense, and no corporate spin that could possibly save them. The digital paper trail was perfect, absolute, and entirely damning. Bradley Carmichael finally broke. The last fragile remnants of his monstrous ego shattered completely. His legs gave out beneath him, entirely unable to support the crushing weight of his inevitable, permanent destruction. He collapsed heavily onto his knees right on the luxurious carpet of the Ritz-Carlton. He clutched at his chest, his breath coming in sharp, agonizing wheezes, his face buried in his hands as the reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence consumed his entire existence. Beside him, Sloan descended into absolute hysterical madness. The illusion of her grand, wealthy ascension was violently ripped away, leaving her with nothing but the terrifying prospect of a criminal indictment. She dropped to the floor, her expensive heels scraping uselessly against the marble. Tears ruined her meticulously applied makeup, leaving dark, ugly streaks down her pale cheeks. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the disgusted stares of the billionaire investors. She reached out her hands, shaking violently, weeping loudly, begging frantically for a mercy she would absolutely never receive. The sound of Sloan weeping on the plush carpet of the Ritz-Carlton was the only noise echoing across the massive grand ballroom. She crawled toward the polished leather shoes of the Kensington Holdings board members, her tear-streaked face a mask of absolute desperation, pleading for a financial mercy that simply did not exist in this stratosphere of wealth. The elite investors looked down at her with unfiltered disgust, physically stepping backward to avoid contact with a confessed embezzler. Bradley Carmichael remained frozen on his knees, his expensive rented tuxedo bunching around his defeated shoulders. He was entirely paralyzed by the monumental collapse of his fabricated empire. He stared blankly at the massive digital screens displaying his federal wire fraud, his breath hitching in his throat as the reality of his impending imprisonment crushed the remaining oxygen from his lungs. I stood perfectly still, the heavy vintage diamond collar resting cold against my collarbone, watching the total destruction of the man who had aggressively threatened to ruin my life just 24 hours ago. Then the radiating heat of my husband shifted. Liam Kensington stepped around me, his towering frame casting a long, terrifying shadow over the kneeling chief executive officer. Trey, my brilliant brother-in-law, stood silently by the technical podium, his arms crossed over his flawless Tom Ford suit, watching his meticulous legal trap snap completely shut. The billionaire did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to command the absolute obedience of the room. When Liam spoke, his tone was a dark, glacial rumble that froze the blood in Bradley's veins. You invited my executive team to this luxury hotel tonight under the guise of finalizing a $50 million acquisition, Liam stated, his voice slicing through the heavy air with lethal precision. You paraded around this ballroom drinking expensive champagne, entirely convinced that your pathetic, fabricated spreadsheets had successfully blinded the financial analysts at Kensington Holdings. You genuinely believed you were the smartest man in Chicago. But your greatest miscalculation, Bradley, was not the amateur offshore accounts or the blatant theft of employee pension funds. Your fatal error was looking directly at my wife, the most brilliant data analyst in this city, and foolishly believing you could steal her intellect to execute your pathetic corporate fraud. Bradley squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in a desperate, silent denial. He raised his trembling hands, attempting to formulate a defense, but his vocal cords were completely useless. Liam looked down at the broken man with a gaze entirely devoid of any human sympathy. I am standing before my shareholders, your employees, and the local financial press, Liam announced, ensuring his devastating words were captured by the recording devices of every journalist present. Kensington Holdings officially and permanently withdraws our letter of intent. We are completely terminating the $50 million buyout offer. There will be no acquisition. There will be no corporate rescue. You will not receive a single cent of our capital. A loud gasp rippled through the gathered Carmichael Tech employees. Without the buyout, the company was financially dead. But Liam was far from finished. He did not just want to walk away from the deal. He wanted to completely annihilate the enemy who had dared to disrespect his wife. Liam adjusted his immaculate suit jacket and delivered the ultimate corporate death sentence. However, my investment fund did not remain idle while you were busy renting tuxedos and threatening my wife, Liam continued, his voice dropping into a register of pure, calculated menace. While you were desperately trying to mask your catastrophic cash burn rate, my legal and financial teams were making discreet phone calls to every single one of your institutional creditors. We knew your company was drowning in toxic, high-interest corporate debt. We knew you had leveraged every single physical asset, every server, and every intellectual property patent you possessed just to keep the lights on. So Kensington Holdings stepped in. Over the past 48 hours, my firm aggressively purchased every single outstanding loan, every line of credit, and every defaulted promissory note attached to Carmichael Tech. Bradley's head snapped up. His bloodshot eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as the lethal financial maneuver finally clicked in his panicked brain. He understood exactly what Liam had done. By purchasing the debt, Liam was no longer a potential buyer. He was the primary, absolute creditor. He owned the company's very survival. "We bought your toxic debt for pennies on the dollar," Liam declared, his tone as hard as solid steel. "And as your sole majority creditor, Kensington Holdings is officially calling in those loans. Effective immediately, we are demanding the total, immediate repayment of all outstanding corporate debt. Since you have completely drained the company accounts to fund your mistress's offshore lifestyle, you are entirely in default. From this moment on, Bradley, your company belongs to us, and you are completely, irrevocably bankrupt." The words struck Bradley like a physical execution. He let out a ragged, agonizing wail, a sound of pure structural defeat that echoed painfully off the crystal chandeliers. The company he had built, the empire he had aggressively tried to save through fraud and extortion, had just been legally seized right out from under him. He had nothing left. His corporate shares were worthless. His executive power was erased. He was a ruined, destitute man, kneeling on the floor of a luxury hotel, fully exposed to the ruthless judgment of the entire Chicago financial sector. Sloan scrambled away from him, frantically trying to distance herself from the sinking ship, completely forgetting that her own name was stamped across the Cayman Island accounts. The absolute magnitude of their destruction hung heavy in the opulent ballroom. The guests watched the total annihilation of a fraudulent CEO in stunned, captivated silence. Then, piercing through the quiet aftermath of the corporate slaughter, a new and terrifying sound shattered the crisp night air. The harsh, aggressive, and unmistakable wail of multiple police sirens erupted from the street outside the hotel, growing rapidly louder as they aggressively swarmed the grand entrance. The wail of the sirens outside the Ritz-Carlton grew deafening, cutting through the opulent silence of the grand ballroom like a jagged blade. Red and blue lights flashed aggressively through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the terrified faces of the corporate elite in alternating shades of panic. The heavy, gold-plated doors of the ballroom swung open with a violent crash. A tactical team of federal agents strode into the luxurious space, moving with absolute, uncompromising authority. Their dark windbreakers bore the bold, unmistakable yellow lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. They did not pause to admire the crystal chandeliers or the expensive floral arrangements. They marched in a rigid, terrifying formation directly toward the center of the room, their eyes locked entirely on the disgraced chief executive officer kneeling on the plush carpet. Bradley Carmichael looked up, his bloodshot eyes wide with primal terror. The reality of his absolute destruction had finally arrived in the form of federal law enforcement. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a granite jawline, stepped forward and flashed a gold badge that caught the harsh glare of the digital presentation screens. "Bradley Carmichael," the agent declared, his voice echoing loudly across the dead, silent room. "You are under arrest for severe violations of federal securities law, massive corporate wire fraud, and the gross embezzlement of employee pension funds. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Bradley's wrists sounded like a gunshot. The physical reality of the cold steel binding his hands behind his back completely broke whatever fragile sanity he had left. He sobbed, a pathetic, wet sound that disgusted everyone watching. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable tech visionary who had ruthlessly threatened to destroy my career. He was a broken, weeping criminal facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Beside him on the floor, Sloan descended into an entirely new level of hysterical madness. The 29-year-old executive assistant watched the federal agents reading the Miranda rights to her boss, and her mind violently rejected the consequences of her own boundless greed. She realized with absolute certainty that her name was permanently stamped on the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation documents, currently glowing on the massive digital screens. She scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees, her cheap silver sequined dress snagging on the carpet fibers. She threw her arms around Bradley's legs, sobbing uncontrollably, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling in messy, tangled clumps around her tear-streaked face. "Bradley, tell them!" Sloan shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Tell them I had absolutely nothing to do with the financial routing. Tell them I was just following your executive orders. You promised me we were going to be rich. You promised me a luxury penthouse. Please do not let them take me to prison." But there is absolutely no honor among thieves. Bradley looked down at his crying mistress, the woman he had stolen millions of dollars to impress, and his face contorted with raw, unfiltered venom. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin, he violently kicked his leg out, physically shoving Sloan away from him. She fell backward, crying out in shock as she hit the marble floor. "It was all her idea!" Bradley screamed, thrashing wildly against the firm grip of the federal agents holding his arms. "She manipulated me. She set up the offshore accounts behind my back. She forged the transfer documents using my executive clearance. She is the one who stole the employee pension money. She is a manipulative, lying thief. You have to arrest her, not me." The agents did not entertain his pathetic display of betrayal. Two female federal agents immediately stepped forward, hauling the screaming, thrashing executive assistant to her feet. Sloan fought them wildly, her expensive high heels slipping completely off her feet, but her resistance was entirely futile. The cold steel cuffs snapped securely around her wrists, binding her hands over the ruined, wine-stained fabric of her silver dress. Her entire professional future was instantly incinerated. She would never work in the financial sector again. She was permanently blacklisted from Wall Street, publicly branded as a federal co-conspirator, and she would spend the best years of her life locked inside a federal correctional facility. The elite guests, the shareholders, and the betrayed Carmichael Tech employees watched the two fraudsters being physically dragged out of the grand ballroom, their pathetic screams fading down the long, luxurious hotel corridor. I stood perfectly still, my posture radiating absolute, unshakable power. I did not laugh at them. I did not taunt them as they were hauled away in disgrace. I did not need to gloat over their ruined lives. The truth and the full weight of the American judicial system had executed my vengeance with flawless, devastating precision. I looked over at Trey. He stood by the audiovisual podium, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate Tom Ford suit. He gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod, acknowledging the absolute perfection of our synchronized corporate strike. I turned and looked up into the dark, fiercely proud eyes of my husband. Liam Kensington offered me a soft, devastatingly handsome smile. He gently raised my hand, the 5-carat diamond catching the ambient light, and pressed a warm kiss to my knuckles. I smoothly wrapped my arm around his, leaning slightly into his solid, comforting warmth. Together, we turned our backs on the stunned crowd and the absolute wreckage of the fraudulent tech company. We walked out of the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom with slow, measured, and utterly victorious steps, leaving the hypocrites to suffocate in the ruins of their own making. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my corner office. I was sitting in a plush, ergonomic leather chair on the 50th floor of the Kensington Holdings headquarters in downtown Chicago. I took a slow, satisfying sip of perfectly brewed artisanal coffee from a pristine white mug. The panoramic view of the sprawling city skyline below me was absolutely breathtaking, a daily reminder of the untouchable altitude I had successfully reached. I was no longer just a senior data analyst hiding in a cramped, noisy cubicle. I was no longer an undercover auditor quietly dismantling corrupt corporate executives. I was the founder and chief executive officer of my very own artificial intelligence investment fund, operating as a highly autonomous, massively funded subsidiary under the Kensington Holdings umbrella. I had designed, coded, and launched the enterprise entirely with my own intellect and my own strategic vision. My customized predictive algorithms were currently managing hundreds of millions of dollars in legitimate, highly verified global assets. I set my coffee mug down on the smooth surface of my massive Italian marble desk. I opened my sleek laptop and reviewed the skyrocketing growth metrics of my new portfolio. A profound, quiet sense of total fulfillment washed over my soul. The people who had ruthlessly mocked me, who had tried to steal my genius and destroy my future, were currently sitting in cold federal prison cells, stripped of all their fake wealth and pathetic arrogance. I had not just survived their malicious corporate bullying, I had completely conquered their entire world. I had proven to myself and to the entire financial industry that the sweetest, most devastating revenge imaginable is not found in screaming matches or petty retaliation. The absolute best revenge is achieving spectacular, monumental success and living a beautiful, powerful life that your enemies can never, ever reach. The ultimate lesson to draw from Gemma's spectacular corporate triumph is that true power never needs to scream for attention. In today's hyper-competitive professional world, toxic individuals often mistake quiet diligence for weakness and silence for submission. They build their fragile empires on a foundation of sheer arrogance, flashy designer labels, and the relentless bullying of those they perceive as socially or financially inferior. However, their greatest and most fatal downfall is always their own blinding hubris. They drastically underestimate the quiet observers who rely on raw intellect, empirical data, and unwavering integrity rather than cheap office politics. Gemma teaches us that when faced with overwhelming disrespect, public humiliation, and corporate manipulation, the most devastating weapon you can possibly wield is absolute, unshakable composure. When arrogant bosses or malicious coworkers attempt to tear you down, they desperately want an emotional reaction. They want you to break, cry, or engage in a petty, unprofessional screaming match. By entirely denying them that satisfaction, you maintain total control of the narrative. Instead of fighting loudly, you must fight strategically. You gather your evidence, secure your personal boundaries, and let the indisputable facts do the heavy lifting. Furthermore, this story proves that you never have to stoop to the malicious level of your abusers to secure true justice. You do not need to play dirty to win. The natural, catastrophic consequences of greed and deceit will inevitably catch up to those who operate without a moral compass. The absolute best, most agonizing revenge you can ever inflict upon your enemies is your own monumental, untouchable success. By elevating your own life, launching your own dreams, and refusing to let their toxicity define your potential, you claim the ultimate victory. If you have ever been severely underestimated in the workplace or survived a toxic corporate environment, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your own story of sweet, well-deserved success in the comments below.